I took a look at my designs that I created from my design walk, and I picked one out that I'd like to use for my rivet pendant. I needed to make sure that it fit in a 2" by 2" square, so I followed the directions to do that using my Google Doc to resize it, because this on my page here is too big. So I resized it in the Google Doc following the directions, and I printed it out. So now I cut out my printout here, and I have the drawing of the pendant that I'm going to cut. This is going to be the top piece of metal. Remember, you have 2 pieces of metal in your kit that you're going to use. One 2" by 2" square of copper and another 2" by 2" square of brass, okay? Make sure you're using the metal that do not have the X on it. The ones with the X on them are going to be used for a different project. That's thinner metal. So right now, I need to come up with a design that this top piece of metal is going to connect to the bottom piece of metal. So I need to design the bottom piece. When I connect it onto the piece of metal, it is going to fit in a 2" by 2" square, okay? So I have to make sure that I can certainly use a ruler, okay? And I could draw out some 2" by 2" squares on my paper. I can always go to the supply list as well. That goes all the way up to the top, doesn't it? I could go to the supply list as well and look at the, there. I have the picture of a 2" by 2" square in my supply list as well listed. So you could use that for designing. So these are all 2" by 2". And I'm going to connect, I'm going to rivet, remember, rivet. This is a way of connecting metal, okay, with rivets. So I'm going to connect this top piece of metal to the bottom piece of metal. But then I don't want to keep the bottom piece of metal just a square. I want to design the bottom piece of metal, okay? So if these are cut out, let's say this is copper, and these spaces are cut out. If I just do the exact same design, if I just cut this outside edge of my brass, right, and I just cut that out, when I attach my copper on top of the brass, I'll see through these holes to brass. So the top here would be copper. You could do it the other way too. You can make the top brass. The top is copper for me. And then if I cut this out of brass, and once I put this on top, I'll see through to the holes underneath. And those holes then through there will look like brass. Does that make sense? Okay. So that would just be tracing the outside edge of this design. So you would see it exactly, you know, you would see through these holes to the back color of metal. You could also decide to do a little more designing to it. What could I do? I could turn it, and maybe I want to create some sort of design, because remember, it's got to fit in a 2" by 2" piece of metal. Okay. So maybe this will be cut away in the brass underneath. Okay, but you see how now I have brass from underneath that you can see. You see that? And maybe here. Maybe I'll trace this border of my copper. Okay. Here, I cut out, see that? I cut out the negative spaces. So now, if I put it on this design, if this is my copper, remember, I cut my first one out of copper. I'm drawing the sheet underneath, brass. Maybe I'll cut that out. But maybe I want to keep this brass here. So I'll look through my copper to my brass. This doesn't make sense to cut. And I have to remember, wherever I am drilling the holes to make the rivets, wherever I'm connecting it, in my case here, 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 and here, there has to be metal underneath that, okay? So maybe I'm deciding I'll cut this away from the brass, and this away from the brass, okay? So then my brass piece will end up being cut out like that. Now I'll tell you, we're actually going to connect this to the square first, and then we'll cut out the metal underneath it. Okay, so you can do a different design. You can figure out how you want to design it. Maybe I want to include some sort of hook to hang it from. This is very similar to my first design. You know, I would see through. This is all brass underneath, except this part I'd cut away. So now I actually have a hook I could hang this from. So my brass would be all solid, but I've now added a bit of metal there and cut out a hook. See that? So however you want to design it, the first thing, you'll cut out your metal, your first sheet of metal. In my case, it was copper. And then I'm going to teach you how to rivet it, how to connect it to the square of brass underneath. And then you'll cut out your design from underneath. Here's my finished one. You can see I did copper for the top design, right? For my first sheet of metal, I cut copper. Then I attached my copper piece of metal to a square, to the entire square of brass. And then I drew my design on the brass using my Sharpie, and I cut out the brass, okay? So it was connected when I cut out the brass. So I had a whole square, and then I went in and I cut around, and I punched holes here, and I cut those out, and then I filed and sanded my brass. You can see the rivet connections here on the back, okay? Hope that makes sense. Ask me if you have any questions. After you cut out your first piece of metal, it might get a little wonky, kind of not flat anymore. So you could take the flat end of your ball peen hammer and hammer very lightly your piece of metal on the steel plate. Then we need to take the awl and we need to make some dents where we're going to punch the holes to make the rivets, okay? So I'm making 4 rivets on my top piece of copper for this rivet pendant. So I am now taking my awl and denting it on my metal, on my steel plate, 4 holes where I've thickened up the design, okay? So I'm gonna take my metal punch and tighten that screw, make sure the screw's tight, make sure your goggles are on, and then you're gonna punch all the holes on your top sheet of metal. You need 2, 3, or 4 holes, okay? Okay, so step 1, flatten metal if needed, right? On that steel plate, you're going to use that flat end of the hammer and hit lightly. If you hit too hard, you'll dent your metal, okay? So if you need to flatten your metal, make sure you do that. And then step 2, you're going to dent and punch all the rivet holes for your top piece of metal. Okay. Then you're going to want to sand your metal. Sand where those holes went. And I also want you to sand the back sheet of metal as well, all the way to 600. Remember, sketch notes include words and pictures, right? I'm drawing a little picture to use my ball peen hammer on my steel plate and lightly tap it on my metal, right? So then I want to dent and punch, right? Same thing. Really keeping those visuals in mind is going to help you remember the steps of the process. Okay, step 3, I'm going to sand the top and bottom sheet all the way to 600, which means I'm going to do the 220, the 320, the 400, and the 600. Remember to do that in opposite directions, right, for each one. So see how I'm including information from another page of sketch notes here? And then with your Sharpie, make a dot through one of the top holes to the back sheet of metal and then dent it with an awl and punch it out. Only one. I know you have 2, 3, or 4 holes on your top sheet of metal, but I want you to punch only one out of the back sheet of metal, okay? That's very important. Don't punch all the holes in the back yet, okay? I feel like it's a little harder to punch through the brass, so you might have to punch it a couple times. Now, if you had a hard time punching that hole through the back sheet or through the brass, you can always take your round file from your 6-pack of files and you can always open up that hole a little bit. Don't do it too much though, because our wire just fits in there and we don't want to make it too loose. Okay, next step, I'm going to line up the top piece of metal onto the bottom piece of metal, right? Or to the back sheet, we'll call it. Okay, and then for my specific example, kind of looks like this, doesn't it? And then it has those holes already punched on the top, right? This is the top piece, okay? And this is the back sheet. Okay, and then I'm going to use a Sharpie. Sorry, super sloppy handwriting. I'm going to use a Sharpie and mark through one hole. Only one hole. Oh my God, only one hole. How many holes, Miss Capriolo? Just one. Oh my goodness, only one. What about 2 holes? No, just one. Okay. So now I'm going to dent hole in back sheet, punch hoops hole, and file if needed. Then you're going to take your 16 gauge wire, that's the thicker wire that we have in our kit, and put it off the end of your V block. And I want you to take your flat file from your kit and file the end of the wire flat, okay? It should only take you a couple swipes with the file to get it flat. Then I want you to take the piece of wire and I want you to push it through the top sheet of metal, that hole, and then through the bottom sheet of metal. It's probably a little bit loose. I did my best to get you the supplies that would make it a snug fit, but it's probably a little loose. Now we only want the tiniest bit hanging out of the back, about the width of a piece of metal. And then we're going to take our cutters and we're going to cut just a tiny bit extra on the other side. Now one end of that wire is filed flat, remember? We need to file the other end of the wire we just cut. I like to put it on my steel plate and hold my non-dominant hand down, holding the metal, like in a peace sign with my 2 fingers like that. And then I take the file with my other hand and I file straight in between the 2 fingers. Now, if you're having a hard time doing that and your wire keeps popping out because the holes might be a little bit loose, okay, it might not be a snug fit, the wire might be a little bit loose in there. If you're having a hard time filing it this way and keeping it in the holes of the metal, you can also take your half-round pliers, okay, and hold the piece of wire with your half-round pliers against the steel plate and file it with your flat file. This is taking off length of the wire, but it's also flattening the wire. So you can flip it over and file that other side to make sure it's flat. See, I'm holding it with the half round pliers and I'm filing back and forth with my flat file to make sure both ends are flat and that it's the correct length. So my next step, I need to take my 16 gauge wire, okay, and I need to file the end flat. Remember, I kind of laid it off the edge of the V block, and I want to file it flat, okay? Then I'm going to put my next step on the next sheet of paper here. Oops, yep, number 7. The next step, I'm going to put the wire through, sorry, I have very sloppy handwriting. Put the wire through the top and bottom of back sheet of metal, right? Put wire through holes on top and bottom sheets of metal, okay? And then while it's through, I need to cut and file the other end of the metal wire. Now this is really, really important how long the metal is that you cut. Let's pretend we're going to look at our 2 pieces of metal. Draw this with me in your notes. If we're going to look at our 2 pieces of metal, but from the side, okay, so here's one piece of metal from the side and the other piece of metal. Remember, we have holes drilled through, right? And then you put that wire through, okay? One end is flat, and the other end, when you cut it, is going to get kind of wonky, kind of smushed. Cut a little extra so you can file it flat. Do you see, if this is my piece of metal, and here's my second piece of metal, again, we're looking at it from the side. Do you notice that the amount sticking out of the metal is the same thickness as a piece of metal? Do you see that? That's really only about 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter on a ruler. I'm not talking inches now. I'm talking millimeters. It is so tiny. I mean, it's like the thickness that my marker makes on the paper here. So I need 1 millimeter, or the thickness of a piece of metal, sticking out of each ends of the metal. So that's, if this is the wire, that's 1, 2, 3, 4 millimeters is how much wire I need to make this wire rivet, okay? And while I'm filing it, I can hold the wire with those half round pliers if necessary, right? If I can't seem to file it while it's stuck in the metal. Once you filed both ends flat, take your half round pliers and pick up that little bit of wire, and I want you to push it through the top piece of metal and then push it through that second piece of metal, through the one hole that you've punched through the back piece of metal, okay? And then you're going to lay this on your steel plate. There should be a little bit of wire popping out, right, of the top, and take the ball end, the round end of your ball peen hammer, and tap, tap, tap straight down on that wire, okay? Straight down. Remember, if the wire's too long, it's going to slump over like a candy cane. We don't want it too long. You only need a little bit, about 1 millimeter sticking out of each side. Then you'll flip over your metal, push your metal down so the wire is sticking out of the back, and tap, tap, tap with the ball end of the ball peen hammer, the round end of the ball peen hammer. Flip it again, push your metal down again, and then you can use the flat end of the hammer and tap, tap, tap to flatten the rivet. Flip it over and tap again with the flat end of the rivet. You've just made your first rivet. Alrighty, next step, right? I'm threading, after I've filed the wire. Thread the wire through the holes, right, of both pieces of metal, right? Put the metal on the steel plate or the steel block, whatever you want to call it, and you're going to tap, tap, tap. I guess I say tap and not pound, right? You're just tap, tap, tapping the wire with the round end of that ball peen hammer. Okay? So here's that wire. Sticking out of my metal. Boy, that's too long. What happens if the wire's too long? If you make your wire sticking out of your metal too long and you tap, 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 it'll slump over like a candy cane. That is bad news, okay? That is bad news bears. But you will tap, tap, tap with the round end of that hammer, okay? Because what happens to the wire then is it starts to kind of mushroom, starts to kind of get a flat edge to it. Do you see that? So tap, tap, tap the wire with the round end of the ball peen hammer, and then flip your metal over, push the metal down so the wire's sticking out of the other end, and tap, tap, tap the wire on the other side, right, with the round end of the hammer. Okay. We start with the round end of the hammer to get that kind of mushroomed out, to spread it out, okay? So once you have those both kind of spread out, I guess it's through the metal like that, then the next step is you're going to flip your metal and tap with the flat end of the hammer. You notice my handwriting is getting sloppier and sloppier. And then do it again. Flip and tap. Flip and tap, right? So then you've made your rivet. Once you have your first rivet, you need to punch a hole for your second rivet. You want to do it opposite of the first hole. Now this is a little trickier because we need to punch through the top sheet of metal. And it's harder to punch through the brass, I feel like. So I punched through it and there's still a little bit of metal there. I could always take my cutters and I could try to cut off that extra bit of metal if you can't quite punch it through. See that? And now I could take my hole punch and I could try to punch through that hole again if I was struggling with getting that first hole punched through, okay? So now I've punched right through my top sheet of metal into my bottom sheet. And now I'm going to do the same process for making the next rivet. Take the long piece of 16 gauge wire and a flat file. Hang the wire slightly off the edge of my V-block and use my file to file the end flat. Then I'm going to take that flattened end of wire, put it through these second holes, okay? Remember, I only need about 1 millimeter sticking out of the back, okay? And I'm going to cut a little longer than 1 millimeter sticking out of the front, so I have enough extra wire that I can file flat, okay? Then lay your metal back on the steel plate and try to file it. Remember, if that wire keeps slipping out, just hold the wire with your half round pliers with a little bit of each end sticking out of each side there, and hold it on your steel plate and file straight across. So you're flattening the end of the wire, right? And you remember, you're shortening a little bit too, okay? So once you have both ends flat, then you can pick it up from your steel plate there. See how I did that? Pick it up with the tip of the half round pliers and put it back through the holes that you've punched. Then lay your metal on the steel plate and take the round end of your ball peen hammer and tap, tap, tap the top of that wire to start your rivet. It's kind of mushrooming out the end of the wire, straight down. Then take your metal, flip it over, push your metal down so the wire's sticking out of the back, and tap, tap, tap with the round end on the wire on the back. Once you've started to spread that out, you keep flipping it back and forth, push your metal down, that's really important so you have some wire sticking out, and then you can start to tap it with the flat end of the hammer. Tap, 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 flip it, tap, tap, tap. Great. We're going to repeat that same process for the remainder of your holes. You punch a hole, then rivet. Punch a hole, then rivet. Now, you would be done if you were just doing one rivet. But for this project, you need to do 2 to 4 different rivets, okay? So the next step then would be to punch the second hole through the bottom, right? Actually, you're punching it through the top sheet of metal to the bottom sheet, right? Because the hole's already on the top. So punch your second hole through top sheet and bottom, right, at the same time. And make sure that hole is opposite. The hole should be opposite, kind of the opposite side of your first hole. Okay? So if I am attaching one sheet here, here's my one sheet of metal. Let's pretend, here, let's color it. Let's pretend this is, well, we'll say brass because I've got yellow. So we'll say that's closer to brass on top. Okay. And I want to attach it to my copper sheet, which is on the bottom. Look at that. I'll use my highlighters. Okay. You can certainly color code your sketchbook designs to help you think about different color choices in your project. Colored pencils, markers, whatever. So if I did my first rivet, right, and we're using copper right now, if that was my first rivet, I want to go opposite for my second rivet. So I would punch through this first hole into my second sheet of metal and make my second rivet, right? Then I would punch, I don't know, the third hole could be here, punch, rivet, right? And then we'll go opposite that. Then we'll punch and rivet, okay? So you punch your second hole through the top sheet, holes opposite, so you punch, and then step 12 would be rivet. And then step 13 would be punch the next hole. Step 14, rivet. For as many holes as you have, you do the hole, then rivet, hole, rivet, hole, rivet. If you do all the holes at once on the bottom sheet and you make one rivet, the rest of the holes won't line up. I promise you that. It'll move slightly. So you always do one hole at a time on the bottom sheet. Once you've completed all the rivets, now you can cut out your second sheet of metal.